What was the weirdest, oddest, most shocking thing you found when clearing out the things of someone who passed on?
So, I had a friend some years ago. She was quite sexually exploratory. She was unfortunately hit by a car, no one's fault, just an accident, and died. In my friend group that she was a part of, we decided that her parents should not have to deal with her sex toys. She had a sex swing and a machine thingy, so we broke into her apartment and stole her sex toys. It was the weirdest experience ever. But I think she would have laughed her ass off over it. ETA, holy smokes, I write this little comment before going to bed and wake up to awards and tons of really nice comments. Thank you all, I'm trying to get through all of them and they all warm my heart.
I used to work for an auction house that would come in after a person died, usually at instruction of their child who didn't have the time to deal with it themselves, and catalog everything then sell it. We saw amazing things, perfectly preserved baby toys from the 20s and 30s. Sets of family china from great whoever's wedding perfectly packed away. One house looked like it was frozen in the 60s. No new appliances or furniture, just original style maintained perfectly by grandma till her death. The best find was a hidden archive of World War II memorabilia from when the deceased person fought in the war. He clearly hid it away from sight and mind, back of a basement closet. We found guns, tons of medals and patches, an old uniform, and a few pictures. We called their child to ask if they wanted to keep any of this. We noted that some of the medals were very important, but they had us get rid of everything. I had to look up each one before placing it on the market, and that man saved a lot of ass in his day.
Not quite the same, but our office cleaner told me about the time they lifted the carpets in their house to find a whole set of Polaroid photos from sex parties that took place in the house by the previous occupants. She said there were quite a few faces she recognized still in the village.
My husband's first wife died of cancer a few years before we started dating. When she died, he didn't have the time or energy to deal with a lot of her things, so he basically just packed everything up into boxes and stuck them in the basement. Years and years later, we were engaged and about to move, so we decided to go through the boxes together. We knew she was big into snowboarding, but we didn't know how much until then. We found various pictures of her out on the slopes with Jake Burton, founder of Burton Snowboards, Mike Olson, founder of Lib Technologies which produces Roxy Snowboards and a few other brands, and David Kemper, founder of Kemper Snowboards. Apparently she was tight with the pioneers of snowboarding.
This is one from the lighter side. When I was growing up, my grandfather was never into sports. He encouraged us to play and even took us to a handful of pro games, but he barely enjoyed it himself. He always said that following pro sports was nice for kids, but there's something wrong with adults who do so. When he died, my sister and me found his secret stash. Dun dun dun. It was a couple old trunks full of Boston Braves memorabilia. There was game jerseys and t-shirts, signed bubblegum cards, souvenir bats and hats, and at least 100 ticket stubs. Apparently he was a hardcore, president of the Boston Braves fan club level aficionado. When the Braves left Boston in 1952, it broke his sports fan heart in a way that he never recovered. Not the most tragic tale, and it's even a bit amusing. But it's kind of sad too. Being a Braves fan was his thing, it was his guilty pleasure, his passion, and apparently part of his identity. Then they left and he was never the same.
We found out my grandfather was an ambulance driver, medic in Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. We found his dog tags, orders, pictures and everything. He had always claimed he was in the army but stayed in California. He never talked to anyone about it, not his wife, his brothers, his children. When he passed away in '92, 2 old vets showed up and talked about him saving their life.
Grandma had a bunch of burnt pots and pans in her closet. She was trying to hide the fact she was going senile and didn't know if it was okay to just throw them in the trash. Edit, she would also have me come over in high school to patch up the garage and car when she would clip the sides pulling in. As if I didn't then go home and tell my parents that she had hit the garage again. Day she died, she walked a mile on her treadmill, went shopping at the grocery store with her daughter, as we had taken the car by that point, made herself dinner and went to bed.
When my grandmother died, we were going through her closets and found a marriage license for my grandfather and another woman, dated 6 months before he married my grandmother. Apparently, he got jilted and Mema caught him on the rebound. My mom knew the woman, and had never heard about a relationship between her and granddaddy.
Clearing out my mill house, we found 6 2LTR ice cream tubs full of used syringes. They were for her cat who was diabetic, but he died 5 years previously.
Horribly abusive father-in-law died recently. Mill left him a few years ago. Found multiple copies of her house keys and garage door openers, as well as various tools and personal belongings that he had stolen from her so that she'd need his help fixing things around her house.
Some old farmer died in the village I grew up in. Well, when cleaning out his farm they found a fully functional and maintained anti-tank gun, Pack 34 if I remember correctly. Plus ammo.
When my grandmother died, one of my jobs following the funeral was going through all of her paperwork. We ended up finding a few fantastic things, some of which I still don't have the full story for. My two favorites were a personally addressed invitation to a luncheon at LBJ's White House, birthday and anniversary cards between her and my grandfather, who had been together for 60+ years before he passed 20 years before her. They bought, and a few were handmade, cards, and would sneak the card back to the other to write a new message each year and return it. My sister and I looked through them and realized we were holding the entire history and account of my grandparents' loving marriage in front of us. It was the most beautiful example of love I've ever seen.
My grandmother. Growing up on a North Carolina farm, she was able to take French in high school because my great-grandparents insisted on it being available in the local school. She had a pen pal in France who was about the same age. She had a series of letters from her pen pal, with the very last one saying, "They say that the Nazis are almost here, see edit." He sent a newspaper saying it, not a letter, as the last thing he sent. Edit. Having so many people offering help figure out the details has encouraged me to find out more. Just spoke to my mother and aunt. Apparently, it wasn't the last letter that said that, but that her pen pal sent her a newspaper with a headline that said that the Nazis were almost there, or something like that. It was the last thing my grandmother received from him. The last actual few letters before that seemed like something that was a boring school project. My mother has the newspaper but said it practically disintegrates when she touches it, but she can scan it. She has the letters, but again, they aren't as interesting. Also, the pen pal was in the middle of France, not a major city. Saint Etienne, she said Saint Stephen from memory, but has to go find it. Further, the letters from the pen pal have an address. My mother is open to sending them to this person's family. She brought it up, but then there's the question of if that's something they would even want or not. Edit 2. People are asking for more info when I get it. I will do so. Edit 3. My mother saved pictures of the pen pal and his brother that were with the letters to my grandmother, and postcards from his town that he sent so my grandmother could see his town. But we only have the last 2 letters, and not ones before that.
My mum and dad, I was helping, were clearing out my granddad's place when I found his collection of shrunken heads he had acquired when he was in the Merchant Navy in an old box under his bed.
When my grandma died, my mom and my aunt asked me to be the one to go through her closets. I found a lot of interesting stuff, but the most shocking was her personal diary dating back more than 40 years. My granddad cheated on her very openly, which I already knew, but she never talked about it. Reading her own perspective on the story was a wild ride. I didn't keep the diary. My mom didn't want it either, so I just gave it to my aunt. I don't know if she kept it. Edit. Wow, I wasn't expecting this to get so much attention. I guess I now have to tell the full story. So the area where I live is an urban place now, but in the 60s, 70s when this story took place, it was fairly rural, and this story goes the way rural stories tend to go. It's also worth noting that this story takes place in South America, so culture is a bit different. My grandparents didn't get too much chance to know each other before marriage. He was a friend of a family member, he was introduced to her and they married a few months later. They had 5 children, but as the years passed he just grew discontent? I don't remember the words she used specifically, but the main point is that he was looking for more, if you know what I mean. He started cheating on her. According to her diary, she knew, but she decided not to do anything drastic out of fear of not being able to support her family by herself. 5 children are a lot of mouths to feed. But it all came to a head when she heard that her husband had an extra-marriage son. At this point she kicked him out of the house. The diary doesn't describe it that way, but it's essentially what happened. The most interesting part is what happens next. The mother of my granddad's other children, was, to put it lichtly, a beep. The diary doesn't go into detail, but my grandma heard that the kids were neglected and abused. So, she asked her husband to bring her the children. So, my grandma took care of his husband's extramarital children, a boy and a girl, aged 5 and 4 respectively, if I remember right. So now she had 7 children in her house that she was taking care of. The diary doesn't directly say what happens next, but inquiring from my oldest aunt, who remembers the ordeal, after several years my granddad's mistress came to the house and demanded to take the children away. The most interesting part of reading the diary was seeing the way she described her own feelings. The first few chapters were heartbreaking to read, but she wrote it in a very hopeful tone. The last page of the diary was a confession, where she said that she forgave her husband and his mistress for everything they'd done to her. While I was reading it, I could feel her heartbreak. My grandparents never legally divorced, but they lived separately for the rest of their lives. He built a house in another rural area. That area is still rural today, and the house still stands, where he lived for a few decades before moving in with one of my aunts. He died in 2017 and my grandma died in 2018. During my grandma's funeral, before I discovered the diary, the oldest son of my granddad's mistress said that he considers my grandma to be her real mother. She cared for him and his sister when nobody else did, and he said that thanks to her he's still here. He and his sister are part of the family as far as we're concerned. As for their mother, I have no idea what happened to her. My grandmother was the sweetest person I've ever known. And it honestly amazes me that she went through so much and managed to stay hopeful and positive.
When my grandpa died, we were going through his stuff to see if we wanted to keep anything and found an old porno paperback book. It was called something like Linda's Lusty Night. It was super corny compared to today's standards but still raunchy. Me, my brother, and cousins were reading lines of the book out loud to each other. It was hilarious. Edit, Freudian slip.
I found a letter to a man my mom was pursuing romantically and things didn't work out. She was begging and pleading with him to stay for the sake of myself and my brother. She just wanted us to have a good father figure and didn't want him to leave. It was heartbreaking to read. I think I still have it somewhere but never went to reread it.
My grandma was a child of the Depression, and as such didn't trust banks. She lived alone for years and towards the end started developing dementia. When she had to be moved for care, we found Ziploc baggies with thousands of dollars hidden all over the house. In the deep freeze, taped the back of furniture and underneath tables, in the backs of the toilet, etc. Her house was sold to placate Medicaid, and the people who bought it were her long-term neighbors who loved her very much. They called another 5 or so times when they found even more money in the floor, the cellar, the shed. I believe there is probably still money hidden that we'll never know about. She spent her last years on Social Security, budgeting every dime, and all the while was sitting on a small fortune. Thankfully Medicaid didn't know about her stash, so the family got to keep it all.
A friend of mine, 47 when he passed, had every closet in his house filled with vintage clothing because he was planning on opening a used clothing store. He had over 4,000 items that were sorted by style, size, color, etc. Nobody had a clue he had been procuring clothing for what must have been years.
I found a big black dildo the size of my arm, and a load of BBC porn when I was clearing out my great-aunt's place. The weirdest thing is that she was insanely racist.
Found my grandpa's stash box with a setup for heroin and an antique vibrator, like made of brass. Wish I had a pic. I mean, I knew grandpa used to party, but damn.
My bio brother died when I was a teenager, and we were very close. I didn't realize how close he was to me until after his death, as I found lots of our old drawings and toys in his hope chest, as well as a small, hidden collection of my and my sister's old underwear. I still love and miss him, but that certainly threw me for a loop.
He had a list of 100 names, 87 of which were crossed off with red ink. To this day, we don't know how he was connected to them or what it meant.
My boss's father was an oil and gas engineer who has traveled the world for decades for work while the kids grew up in Texas. His family thought of him as a quiet, introverted man who spent his life earning a living for his family. When he passed, my boss went through his stuff and found evidence of dozens of affairs all over the world.
May your day be filled with joy and happiness. And please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more quality content every day.